Star Trek, Starfleet Academy, Crisis on Vulcan, Chapter 1. Two suns hung low in a turquoise sky. The higher one was a bloated crimson, a squashed red oval that gave little warmth. The lower sun was merely a brilliant point of blue-white light. Across a vast, nearly flat plain of harshly glittering crystalline rock, almost exactly the corroded copper-green color of Spock's blood, the horizon became jagged. A range of cobalt-blue volcanic cones thrust their sharp peaks upward, and each mountain cast two sharp-edged shadows on the plain. One shadow a deep violet, the other paler one gray-green. Almost directly overhead, an irregular, buttery yellow crescent moon rode waves of crimson, orange, and purple aurora, the shimmering colors as restless as an ocean. Off in the east, a smaller, rounder gray moon had just risen above the roof of the Belton Conference Center, where 50 diplomats worked to end a war that had gone on for generations. In the darker sky above the sleek building, a few random stars already glittered, their light dimmed in the auroral display. High meteors, their trails brilliant white, scratched across the western sky. "It is all very," began Cha Tuan Mar Lorville, a Marathon youth who had only a few weeks before set foot on his ancestral planet for the first time in his life. The short, stumpy boy hesitated, searching for the right words. "It is very, very fascinating," said Spock. Cha turned his head, his mane of iridescent hair glimmering in the double light of the setting binary suns. "No, I was trying to say beautiful, but in a more intense way. It is more beautiful than anything I've ever seen." The Marathon boy stole a quick glance back at the Belton complex, lowered his voice, and murmured, "It is a vision given us by the ancient maker." Spock raised an eyebrow. "The ancient maker?" With an embarrassed shrug, Cha looked away. "I am almost an adult. Such things are forbidden. I cannot speak of them." "Ah, a religious taboo," Spock said. "I will not question you." Cha relaxed. "Thank you. But surely even one who is without the knowledge of the ancient maker can see the glory, the beauty of all this." Spock tilted his head as he considered. The air of Mareth was thin and, at this latitude, bitterly cold in his nostrils. He took a deep breath. "The arrangement of the landscape and the placement of astronomical bodies is aesthetically attractive," he admitted, "though of course it is temporary. The most interesting point for me is a double sun. Mareth is one of the few inhabited planets that orbits a double star. Most binary system planets orbit one of the two suns, but not both." Cha shook his head. "You Vulcans have no soul," he complained. "You're all logic and mathematics and science. You don't appreciate the poetry of such a vision." He nodded toward the west. "The larger sun, the reddish one, is Hamarka, the creator, the one my people call the ancient maker. The small, brilliant point of blue-white light, the one that dances around Hamarka, is Valash, the jester." Spock nodded. He noted again that he was cold. Mareth was not a particularly cold planet. It was even warmer than Vulcan in the lower latitudes. But Belton, an ancient religious and cultural center, was close to Mareth's North Pole. After 18 years of learning Vulcan discipline, though, Spock was used to ignoring mere physical discomfort. "It sounds as if the two suns are part of a myth," he suggested. "Yes," responded Cha. He shifted his feet, making the short columns of frost crunch and crackle. "I can tell you that. I am not yet of age, and the stories are not part of the true lore. In the beginning, they were alone. Then Valash challenged Hamarka to bring forth some new thing in the universe. It was to be a thing to make them both laugh, if Hamarka could do that. Then, with the thought, Hamarka created Mareth, the world, and all the life upon her, just to amuse the two friends. Is that not a pretty story?" "It is a standard creation myth," Spock pointed out. Sensing that his observation might create some unfavorable emotion in the other boy, he added, although the story is most unusual in its assumption that the universe was created as a... We have no Vulcan term for the concept, but an Earth word is joke. Cha walked a few meters away, leaving a trail of dark footprints against the frost, and sat on a rounded boulder. He huddled into his heavy jacket, for even to someone whose ancestors came from Mareth, the afternoon was growing uncomfortably chilly. Already the distant blue volcanoes had begun to show long, jagged streaks of white frost. "It is a bitter joke," he said softly, "a joke that drove my people away from our home world in the time of my great-grandfather's father's great-grandfathers." Marathons had a curious way of measuring historical periods. Spock looked at his friend. They had only met a few weeks ago, but they had learned they could talk easily to one another. Cha's father, Karos Mar Santor, was a diplomatic assistant in the Shakir mission to the homeworld. Since Spock's father, Sarek, was an accomplished diplomat himself, the two young men had much in common. Spock had no doubt that Sarek would succeed in drawing the three factions together, for his father had infinite patience and a gift for directing negotiations in the most logical channels. Still, the problem was complex and delicate. Mareth, the planet on which Spock and Cha stood, was the second world from the binary star in a seven-planet system. For many centuries, different nations had existed on Mareth, almost always at war. The constant warfare had many causes: struggles for territory, struggles for power, even conflicts over points of religion. More than 500 years earlier, scientists on Mareth, working to create new and terrible weapons, had developed spaceflight. The weapon became a means of escape when a fierce global war broke out. Outcasts from the homeworld of Mareth settled first 2 moons of Gandar, the third planet in the system. Gandar was a swollen gas giant with 11 major moons, 2 of them large enough to support life. Another group of refugees sheltered on distant Shakir, the fourth world in the system, a planet almost inhospitably cold, except for its equatorial region. Shakir was Cha's home. And now that scientists on Shakir had developed a primitive form of warp drive, they had encountered hostile Klingons uncomfortably close to them in space. Suddenly, all the enemy factions in the system had a new foe to dread. The Marathon system had applied to become part of the United Federation of Planets. The Federation was willing, but only if the Marathons could finally resolve their old hostilities. Sarek had launched the historic peace effort that now, after 3 years of diplomatic struggle, was finally on the verge of producing a treaty, and, everyone hoped, a lasting peace. Cha turned to say something to Spock, blinked, and gestured toward the conference center. "Look!" Spock glanced over his left shoulder and noted that all the lights were on. Every light inside and outside the building shone with a clear white glare. "They have achieved accord," he murmured. "The agreement has been reached." Cha came to stand beside Spock. "Yes," he said, his voice surprisingly tense. Raising an eyebrow, Spock studied Cha's profile. The Marathon teen's features showed no pleasure. They were set in a scowl of discontent, anger. Emotions were so hard to read, thought Spock, especially the emotions of aliens. "I wish you satisfaction in the agreement," Spock said. Cha did not look at him. "We'd better go in," he said. The warmth of the conference center was welcome after the chilly afternoon. An aide offered both Spock and Cha a tall, tubular glass with a few centimeters of tashak, a hot Marathon drink. They accepted and quickly gulped the fiery orange liquid, as was polite. It tasted both sweet and bitter, and the spices in it were surprisingly hot. As the steaming drink warmed him from inside, Spock looked around. Dozens of people stood in the grand hall, clustered in groups of 6 or 7. At last, Spock saw his father, Sarek, at the center of one of these groups. The tall, dignified Vulcan towered above the stocky Marathons around him. As the 2 boys maneuvered toward him, Spock noticed that one of the Marathons standing near Sarek was Cha's father, Karos Mar Santor. Like his son, Karos looked tense and unhappy. His mane of hair, even more impressive than his son's, had lost some of its luster, and the rainbow colors were muted, but Karos was a healthy, vigorous man. As he spoke to Sarek, he gave the impression of great energy under weak control. Spock wondered what emotion Karos felt. Was the word angry? Or was it a different feeling? Spock could only guess. Sarek nodded a greeting as Spock and Cha drew near. "Welcome, my son. Good afternoon, young Mar." Cha murmured some pleasantry and then spoke to his own father. "Well?" "The majority have approved a treaty," Karos said shortly, his voice harsh, rasping. "We will not speak of it now." "But, father—" "We will talk of it later," snapped Karos. The abruptness of Karos's manner surprised Spock. Like his son, Karos was an easygoing, humorous individual. True, Spock had come to realize that even a being who enjoyed laughter could be very serious indeed when dealing with matters of importance. And it was equally true that the negotiations had lasted for a long time and had been most demanding. And yet something more was wrong. Spock could sense it in the tension between father and son, in the hopeless but determined glare Cha gave the older Marathon, in the way they both turned abruptly and walked away. Spock moved to his father's side. "Have you reached a satisfactory accord?" Sarek replied, "We have at least forged a treaty. It recognizes the unity of the Marathon peoples, but grants sovereignty to each group. No side is completely satisfied with it." "Then it is not a good treaty?" Sarek gave his son a considering look, the faintest hint of warmth in his eyes. "On the contrary, Spock, the best treaty always leaves every party a little unsatisfied, because all must surrender something of importance in order for the whole group to gain." "I will remember that." The groups had rearranged themselves, with heated but quiet conversations going on all around the room. Outside, both suns had set and the sky had grown quite dark. Marith was near a cluster of bright stars, or rather was within a few dozen light years of them, and some were so brilliant that Spock could see them through the glass windows, even with the interior of the conference center radiant with light. In a far corner, Cha and his father had joined a group of negotiators from Shakir, the cold outpost of the Marathon civilization. They kept looking Sarek's way, and none of the looks were friendly. One of them, a grim-looking elderly Marathon whose hair had faded to silvery blue, turned his craggy, wrinkled face toward the two Vulcans and scowled at them. The hum and murmur of conversation were urgent and low. "Father," Spock said, "the Shakir delegation appears to have strong reservations about the treaty." "Yes," responded Sarek with a sigh. "The old man is Hull Minik-Lasfer, a rebel leader in the space war fought between Shakir and Marith 30 years ago. He was opposed to any agreement, and in some ways the other members of the Shakir delegation agreed with him. They wished to include some concessions that the Marathon delegation refused, chiefly having to do with rites of passage to and from the homeworld. It was a serious block to negotiation, and at last I was able to overcome it only by specifying in the treaty that such questions will be resolved through more negotiations over the next 10 standard years." After a pause, Sarek added, "I do not fully understand the heat with which the diplomats argued this problem. Strong emotions enter into it, and the Marathons are most reluctant to explain their reasons to an outsider." "I have noticed that, Father." The two Vulcans were walking toward a bank of turbolifts that would take them to their quarters. "Still, a treaty of any sort will help the Marathons in their application to join the Federation, will it not?" They stepped into the turbolift, and Sarek said, "Habitation level, diplomatic guest quarters 1. To Spock, he said, "The treaty will do much more than that, my son. You must understand what has happened here. Thanks to diplomacy, the system has avoided bloodshed and war. That is an accomplishment of great merit in itself, and perhaps they have taken a first step, a small step, toward becoming truly one people. That is an even greater accomplishment. Do you understand me?" The turbolift sighed to a stop, and father and son got out. The corridor into which they stepped was softly lit, arched, and silent. They walked toward their rooms as Spock slowly answered, I believe I do understand, Father. You have taught the Marathons the value of diplomacy, the logic of settling their disputes bloodlessly. You have given them a start on the path to full civilization. Not I, Sarek gently corrected his son. The Vulcan way of logic. I am only the instrument of logic on Mareth. Spock, I want you to consider how rare logic is in the universe. Our scientists believe there are hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of sentient races in the galaxy. What is the norm among them? War, hatred, bigotry, force. What is the greatest good we can do for them? To teach them there is a way out, the way our forebears discovered in the control of emotion and the use of logic. The door sensed their approach, identified them as the occupants of the rooms it guarded, and silently opened for them. They stepped inside, and the lights immediately came on. Spock said slowly, Yes, Father, I understand. Good. Sarek sighed. I know your gifts, Spock. You wish to be a scientist, and you've won a great honor in being admitted to the Science Academy on Vulcan. However, remember that a good diplomat may also be a good scientist. The universe is full of warring peoples, and many of them live in planets that our science has neither discovered nor described. After a moment of silence, Spock said, Are we to return home now, Father? The way Sarek looked at him might have made a human teen anxious, for it was a glance that clearly said Sarek had grasped Spock's strong desire to change the subject. But Spock was only half human, and his Vulcan side enabled him to do away with anxiety. Well, almost. Sarek said, Yes, now we will prepare to return home. The treaty will not be official until transmission to the United Federation of Planets for archiving and verification. The little work that remains can be done by subspace communication. We must prepare to leave tomorrow. Tomorrow? Spock asked, not managing to hide the surprise in his voice. So soon? Yes. A Federation ship has entered orbit around Mareth, and it will transport the Marathon off-worlders to their own homes. It will also take us to Vulcan, so we need not call for a Vulcan ship. I see. And what is the ship? Asked Spock. I did not make a point of asking its name. A ship is a ship, replied Sarek. After a moment he said, Though now that I think of it, I did overhear some Marathons speaking of it. I believe the ship we are to take is called Enterprise. Chapter 2. The cloud-streaked turquoise sky, the level plain, the misty, distant blue volcanoes of Mareth shimmered away, and a moment later, a dim, cool cubicle shimmered into existence. Sarek stepped down from the transporter platform, and Spock followed him. A young human man, dressed in the greenish-gold tunic of a Starfleet command officer, left the console from which he had operated the transporter controls. Ambassador Sarek, Mr. Spock, welcome aboard the Enterprise. I am First Officer Christopher Pike. The captain will be pleased to see you. Sarek inclined his head. And I to see him. Thank you, Lieutenant Commander Pike. Captain April wanted me to show you to your quarters, Pike said. He thought you might want to accustom yourselves to our gravity and atmosphere for an hour or so. He'll meet you at 1100, if that is agreeable. Certainly, Sarek said. They left the transporter room and walked down a curving corridor. The first thing Spock noticed was the gravity, lighter than that of Mareth, far lighter than that of Vulcan. He moved carefully, accustoming himself to his new weight. Crew members, men and women, hurried past them, giving them inquisitive but friendly glances as they passed. I understand that congratulations are in order for young Spock, Pike said as they took the lift to the accommodations deck. It isn't every 18-year-old Vulcan who receives an unconditional appointment to the Vulcan Science Academy. Spock gravely inclined his head. Thank you, Lieutenant Commander Pike. I did not realize my acceptance was news. Oh, certainly, Pike said. Your father is a gifted diplomat, and those of us in Starfleet are grateful to him. The Marathon system is a real weak spot in our border with the Klingon Empire, And Sarek's work will make the Federation much more secure. Naturally, we're interested in all the news about him, and in his son. You must be excited about attending the Science Academy." "No," Spock said honestly. "I am gratified, but not excited." "Of course," Spock said with a grin. Pike said with a grin. "Excitement is a human emotion. I forgot for a second. Well, here you are. Adjoining cabins. Your luggage has already been brought here. I'm afraid it's a little plain, but the Enterprise has been called on to fight battles more than to transport honored guests. I hope these will be all right." "They fulfill their function admirably," Sarek said. "Thank you, Lieutenant Commander Pike." "You're quite welcome." Pike indicated a wall-mounted device. "If you wish to set the environmental controls to something more like a Vulcan atmosphere, just call engineering on the intership communicator here. I will come for you shortly before 1100 hours and escort you to the captain's conference room." "Thank you. I shall use the interval to meditate." As Pike turned to leave, Spock said, "Father, may I see the ship?" Sarek replied, "That is up to Lieutenant Commander Pike." "Sure," Pike said. "Come along." As they walked along the curving corridor, Spock breathed deeply and looked around. The atmosphere was ideal for a human crew, but to someone used to the thin air of Vulcan, it was incredibly rich with aromas, lubricants, faint hints of protein and fruit. As they passed a dining area, undertones of minerals and a strong tang of oxygen. "Like to see the engine room?" asked Pike. "That'd be most gratifying," Spock returned. Their tour started there. Assistant Engineer Wellborn welcomed them. Showed them the dilithium containment chambers, reactor coils, and the power controls, and explained about Cochrane warp generators. Spock listened politely, never once indicating that he knew all about these rather elementary processes. Pike then took him to the xenobiology labs, the sensor control center, and finally suggested returning to the transporter room. "The Marathons are coming aboard," he explained. "We're giving some of them a lift to their home worlds. I think we'll just have time to see them aboard before your father has his appointment with Captain April." They returned to the same transporter room where Spock and Sarek had beamed aboard. Pike took his position behind the control console and explained the principles behind the matter transport device. "I understand that Vulcan scientists have helped to refine this invention," he said as he finished. Spock nodded. "Yes, the biological pattern buffer has been made much more reliable thanks to Sunak of Vulcan. Prior to his invention, the transporter was only 99.9992% accurate in transporting living subjects. Thanks to Sunak's incorporation of Vulcan uncertainty physics, it is now virtually impossible for the device to malfunction. From a purely physical perspective, I mean. There is always human error." "Hey," laughed Pike. Spock gave him an inquisitive look. "Forgive me. Of course I should have said operator error. The species of the operator is immaterial to the point. It was thoughtless of me." "No offense taken," Pike said. At that moment, the intercom came to life. "Enterprise, the Marathon delegates are ready to come aboard. 24 to beam up." "We'll take them in groups of 6, Pike responded. "First group, stand by." He adjusted the controls. "Energizing." Spock watched as bands of Marathons came twinkling into existence on the transporter pad. Cha was in the third group, and he made his way over as soon as he stepped off the pad. "Hello, Spock." His voice was low, guarded. "Hello, Cha." "Well," Cha said with a nervous smile, "at least you'll get to see my home." "I look forward to that." Crew members had come to show the Marathons to their quarters. They were a silent group, and Spock realized that something was not right. None of them looked around at the starship or its crew. None showed the least interest in their surroundings, and, except for Cha, no one spoke. As for Cha, he muttered quick, meaningless observations. "Very warm air, isn't it? Wonder where that goes?" He called for no response. In a low voice, Spock said, "Forgive me, Cha, but what is wrong?" Cha gave him a quick glance, his iridescent hair glittering electric blue, magenta yellow. "Wrong? I don't know what you mean, Spock." "You don't seem yourself." "Cha!" was the loud voice of Karos Morsantor, Cha's father. "Come. Here are our quarters." Cha hurried away, not even looking back. The door hissed open. The Marathon father and son entered their quarters, and the door closed again. "We just have time to escort your father to the captain's conference room," Pike said. Spock followed him, still wondering about the transformation that had come over Chaw. It was disturbing. Pike led Sarek and Spock to the conference room, where the tall, craggy Captain Robert April welcomed them with a smile. He turned to Pike and said, "Lieutenant Commander, report to the bridge and take us out of orbit. Set a course for Gandar. Standard impulse." "Yes, Captain," Pike said. "Permission to allow Mr. Spock on the bridge?" Captain April raised his eyebrows. "Granted. Enjoy yourself, Mr. Spock." Spock did not point out that Vulcans did not enjoy themselves. He was too filled with anticipation, a sensation, he thought fleetingly, that in some ways almost resembled excitement. He followed Pike into the turbolift, where Pike ordered, "Bridge." To Spock, Pike added, "Don't expect anything spectacular. You won't even feel anything when we leave orbit, although you'll get a good view of Marith from where we are." "I understand," Spock said. They stepped from the lift onto the bridge. Spock quickly took it all in, a large circular room, the four-wall dominated by an enormous view screen. At the moment, the green, blue, purple, and white-streaked world of Marith rotated there, huge in the view screen, with a clear band of twilight separating the night side from the day side. That, of course, was the effect of the binary sun. "Mr. Ban, I'm here to take us out of orbit," said Pike. The helmsman, a completely bald young man, glanced over his shoulder. "Aye, sir." Pike settled into the captain's seat. "We have a visitor on the bridge," he announced. "This is Mr. Spock. Spock, the lieutenant in the driver's seat, is Ledric Ban. Our navigator is Selena Niles. At communications is Lieutenant Michael Darren. Our science officer is Lieutenant Richard Cheney. And the grumpy old man at the engineering station is Chief Engineer Powell." Spock nodded to each in turn. "Lieutenant Cheney, may I join you?" he asked. "Sure," said Cheney, a strongly built young human with a closely cut crop of red hair. Spock went to stand slightly behind him, marveling at the compact science center. "If you want to know what anything's for, just ask," Cheney said. "It's really pretty quiet now. I'm just monitoring our status, that's all." "Thank you." "Computer," said Cheney, "show us a schematic of the primary stars in this system." "Working," the computer voice said in its mechanical but strangely feminine voice. A moment later, one of the display panels lit with a representation of the two suns, the crushed oval of the red giant, the brilliant blue pinhead of the fierce companion. Swirls of gas connected them. "Fascinating," Spock said. "A binary system that has remained stable for more than 3 billion years. "It's a strange composition of the blue-white companion that does it," Cheney replied. "It takes up just enough cast-off matter from the companion giant to compensate for its own rate of reaction. Most binaries in this configuration are doomed to a few million years of existence at best, but the Marathon system's good for another 4 billion years or so." 4,371,009,603, Spock replied. Catching Cheney's surprised look, he added, "Assuming a uniform rate of matter loss, of course." "Oh, of course," Cheney said with a grin. Behind them, Christopher Pike had ordered a course laid in for Gandar, the next planet out in the system. As soon as the navigation station reported the course laid in, Pike ordered, "Take us out of orbit, helmsman. Ahead standard impulse power." "Ahead standard impulse," repeated Lieutenant Ban, and Spock turned to watch. In the view screen, Marith sank away and out of sight. The stars wheeled as the Enterprise changed course. Then, as the stars stabilized, a brilliant orange point of light glowed in the center of the screen. "Increase magnification by a factor of 10, ordered Pike. The image changed. Now Spock saw an orange disk, streaked with reds and swirled with yellows. Around it hung 8 smaller disks, the principal moons of Gandar. The other 3 moons were too small to see at this distance. "Estimated arrival in 31 hours, the navigator said. "Very good. Maintain course and power." Spock took a deep breath. On their trip to Marith aboard a severely practical Vulcan transport ship, he had seen nothing like this. Vulcan ships depended on mathematical displays, not visual representations of the universe. This way, the human way, was much more, well, fascinating. After an hour, he returned to his quarters, still mulling over what he had seen and experienced. Sarek was in the common sitting area they shared, reading from a compact book display screen. "Well," he said, "the crew of this ship is certainly considerate of you." "Yes, Father," Spock returned. "The bridge is most interesting." Sarek set the book down, tented his fingers, and stared over them at his son. "Spock," he said, "a word of warning. You're still young, and you have a human side to control. Please remember that enthusiasm is an emotion. It is unseemly." Spock returned his father's gaze. Sarek ignored him, picked up his book, and began to read again. On stiff legs, Spock walked into his bedroom, the door hissing closed behind him. He felt, if he had been human, he would have felt an emotion, and a strong one. It was shame.